Coming up, South Korea slaps Google and Meta with fines for privacy violations of $50 million and $22 million respectively. The penalty cumulatively is the biggest that South Korea's Personal Privacy Protection Agency has ever issued. South Korea's central bank says the U.S. and Europe are at risk of sliding into recession, which would trickle down to South Korea and slow its own growth as well. All this as the South Korean won continues to lose power over the greenback, crossing the 13.91 per dollar mark. We have never been in a better position to end the COVID-19 pandemic, says the World Health Organization chief, referring to the weekly deaths caused by COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic. He says the end is in sight.
Good morning. Welcome to New Day at Arirang. Our top story this morning, South Korea's regulators have imposed financial penalties on Google and Meta for violating local privacy laws. The tech giants are blamed for collecting private data for targeted advertising without user permission.
That's right. And in response, Google says it will discuss the matter further with South Korea's Privacy Protection Agency, while Meta has objected to the decision and is looking at options before giving its response. Shin Ah-young starts us off this morning.
South Korea has taken strong action against two tech giants, Google and parent company of Facebook, Meta. The Personal Information Protection Commission, or PIPC, said Wednesday that it's fined Google around $50 million and Meta $22 million for violating local privacy laws.
It has been confirmed that Google and Meta have been violating the law by collecting and analyzing users' personal information for personalized online advertisements without their consent or clearly informing them.
Google has been collecting personal data through its default settings for users to give consent for at least 6 years since 2016. In case of Meta, it has not informed or obtained permission from users for the last 4 years. As a result, over 82% of Google users and over 98% of Meta users in South Korea have been unknowingly allowing the platforms to collect their information. At 100 billion Korean won, or around $72 million in total, the penalties are the biggest the regulator has ever issued for privacy violations. The PIPC also ordered the tech giants to clearly inform users when their information is being collected and used, and to obtain their consent in a way that enables them to exercise their right to privacy. Responding to the fine, Google said it will further discuss user privacy in South Korea with the Commission. On the other hand, Meta said it disagrees with the decision and is open to all options, including taking the issue to court. Shin Ah-young, Arirang News.
The European Union's General Court upheld an antitrust ruling against Google, but reduced its fine to a little over 4.1 billion euros, roughly $4.1 billion from 4.3 billion. The court said Google imposed unlawful restrictions on manufacturers of Android devices and mobile network operators for the gain of its search engine. This is a record fine for an antitrust violation and the second court defeat for the tech giant, which lost its challenge to a 2.4 billion euro fine last year. According to South Korea's central bank, the United States and Europe face a growing risk of recession, which could in turn cause economic slowdown in South Korea. The Bank of Korea attributed the risk to aggressive interest rate hikes in the US, coupled with continued inflation and a cutoff of Russian gas in Europe. A senior official said a recession in the American economy would hit Seoul's exports, while a recession in Europe would cause a sharp rise in raw material prices, as the region's supply chains are very sensitive to external factors. The South Korean currency on Wednesday dipped to its lowest level against the greenback in more than 13 years. Concerns over bigger interest rate hikes by the Fed also sent stocks plunging. Ji-young helps us look beyond the digits.
The South Korean won has tumbled to yet another more than a decade low against the US dollar. During Wednesday's session, the exchange rate crossed the 1,391 mark, reaching 1,395.5 at one point. This marks the weakest figure for South Korea's currency since March 2009, when it topped 1,422 won in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. The won closed trading on Wednesday at 1,390.91, up about 17.3 from the previous session. The plunge came just hours after the announcement of the higher-than-expected U.S. Consumer Price Index, jumping by 8.3% on-year last month. The won is likely to weaken further as there are forecasts the latest U.S. inflation data will push the Fed to maintain its hawkish stance on monetary policies, further strengthening the greenback. Market experts anticipate at least a 75 basis point rate hike by the Fed, and thus more volatility is expected in the local financial markets.
In September, it's certain that the Fed's going to take a giant step with its next rate hike. The won is likely to weaken further against the US dollar to top the 1,400 mark in a short period of time. And it's likely that there'll continue to be a negative impact on stocks.
The benchmark KST also fell below the 2,400 mark earlier during Wednesday's session, prompted by the report on U.S. consumer prices. The KST fell 1.56% on Wednesday, closing the day at 2,411.42. The tech-heavy Kosdaq also dropped, falling 1.74% to close at 782.93. The South Korean government says it'll do all it can to deal with the volatility. During an emergency economic task force meeting on Wednesday, First Vice Finance Minister Bang Gi-sun said growing uncertainties due to possible further rate hikes in major economies have caused greater volatility. He added that the government will monitor the financial and the foreign currency markets with extra caution and called on the related authorities to thoroughly search for all available measures. 엄지영, Arirang News.
Consumer prices are also rising fast here in the nation. Shoppers are paying more for daily commodities like instant noodles and snacks, including the nation's best-loved chocolate pie. Utility bills are also going up ahead of Korea's notoriously cold winter. Here's Choi Min-jung with the breakdown of the figures.
People in South Korea have already had a rather expensive Chuseok holiday due to soaring inflation. And now they are bracing for further price hikes.
Prices aren't falling even after Chuseok, so I'm hesitant. I have to think twice before buying anything.
Included on the list of products that are about to become more costly is Nongshim's instant noodles. From Thursday, the price of a 신라면 will rise by around 11%. So instead of paying 53 cents for a serving, people will now have to fork out 59 cents. Nongshim says the price hike is due to increasing prices of grain caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In total, the company is raising the prices of 26 items. Other instant noodle manufacturers like Palto, Otugi, and Samyang are set to follow suit. The same goes for snacks. Orion is raising the price of its signature choco pie for the first time in 9 years. People will now have to pay 43 cents more to buy a box of 12 choco pies. Orion says the hike was inevitable considering the rising price of raw materials. Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho on Tuesday urged officials to focus on stabilizing people's livelihoods by monitoring price trends after Chuseok. However, pundits say inflationary pressure is bound to get heavier as electricity and gas rates are also expected to jump next month. The inflation rate in August did decline compared to previous months to under 6%. But given the uptick in prices for food products, there are concerns that the rate will not continue on a downward trend. The government has forecast that inflation will hit its peak either at the end of this month or sometime in October. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
The U.S. Producer Price Index increased 8.7% on-year in August, a substantial pullback from the 9.8% rise recorded in July, which could alleviate concerns over continued inflation across the world. It was the second straight month that the pace of increase has slowed, according to the data released Wednesday from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Falling gas prices was one of the major reasons behind the drop. The news comes a day after a disappointing consumer price index report for August triggered a meltdown on Wall Street. The PPI tracks average changes in the prices paid to producers of goods and services. Economists expected year-over-year PPI to jump by 8.8% last month. The European Commission announced measures on Wednesday which they say will raise $141 billion by imposing windfall taxes on energy companies that make abnormally high profits. The proposal includes measures to redirect the proceeds to households and business struggling with soaring energy bills. The bloc says the proposed tax targets power companies that do not burn gas, the price of which has soared lately. It added that other measures on fossil fuel users would also follow suit. The proposals will now have to be approved by member states who will meet to discuss it later this month. We may be approaching the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. That's according to the World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus on Wednesday.
We have never been in a better position to end the pandemic. We're not there yet, but the end is in sight.
The WHO chief also said the number of weekly COVID-19 deaths from September 5th to 11th had dropped to its lowest figure since March 2020, when it was first designated a pandemic. The number of infections have also dropped by 28% in the same week compared to the week prior. He ended the conference by stressing that the world needs to use this chance to control any further spread of the virus and publish 6 policy briefs with the aim of doing this. There are concerns of a twindemic as immunity to both COVID and the seasonal flu has been waning. Authorities say the term is misleading and that they are taking precautionary measures. Experts are also reviewing when would be the right time to lift the indoor mask mandate. Shin Ye-eun has the details.
There are worries about a twindemic here in South Korea. A twindemic refers to a spike of COVID-19 cases along with the seasonal flu. While the chances of a person catching both viral diseases at the same time are low, if they do, the death rate doubles compared to a person who's only infected with COVID-19. Recently, we've seen the number of people with the flu increase. Back in September 2020, only 1 out of 1,000 people went to see a doctor for the flu. Now, this number has increased to 5 out of 1,000. COVID-19 infections have also increased by more than 36,000 in a span of just 24 hours. On Wednesday, nearly 94,000 cases were reported. But the country's health officials have clarified that it'd be misleading to call this situation a twindemic.
Recently, many media outlets have spoken about a multidemic or twindemic, but there's no such medical term. COVID-19 is a pandemic and the flu is not. Stats may suggest this year's flu has hit us harder than the last 2 years, but it's just come a bit earlier. We must take precautionary measures to stop further spread.
This expert asked people to get tested. There are both PCR and rapid antigen tests for COVID and the flu. With authorities high on alert over the spread of COVID-19, health experts say lifting indoor mask mandates would only be possible as early as next spring.
Countries that have lifted mask mandates everywhere have first checked if most of the population has been vaccinated and whether they have antibodies to fight off 80% of the virus. We should too. Then we can start lifting mandates at places that can easily ventilate, like schools. Once people have more antibodies, the country should allow people to take off their masks on public transport.
This health expert also said COVID-19 should be treated at all hospitals, just like the regular flu. She mainly pointed out that putting people with COVID-19 under self-isolation could be dangerous, especially during the flu season, as it's hard to differentiate the two with their similar symptoms. Shin Ye-eun, Arirang News.
It's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. South Korea's population is aging rapidly, and it is projected to become the world's most aged country by 2070, according to a recent study released by Statistics Korea. It said the share of people aged 65 or older will likely reach 17.5% of the total population this year and rise to 46.4% in 2070.
Currently, a person aged 65 or older in South Korea is considered a senior citizen. So with the aging population, should the country raise this age, and what would be the implications if it does? For more, we have Professor Hwang Myung-jin from Korea-U.S joining us this morning. Very warm welcome to you, Professor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Right, well, first off, what does it mean to be a senior citizen in South Korea? What kind of benefits or welfare are you entitled to?
Well, everybody's dream is getting retired, and as I get older, then the many things must be changing that our experiences. Well, the good thing is I don't have to work. I don't have to pay tax. I don't have to maybe, do the family support and most duties of family, society, and the nation. And Korea has a good welfare system for the elderly people. So personally, I have a good pension, insurance for the health care. Sometimes I get the transportation vouchers, and more likely the culture, the tradition, the support and the respect of senior people. These are all good parts of the becoming a senior citizen. The studies that I conducted recently shows that the older we get, the happier we are. This is called the paradox of the aging, which was founded in North America, Europe, and Taiwan, and also confirmed this as truth in my recent study. The happiness index peaks about is moving up to from our retirement age of 65, and then it reaches a peak at age 75. This is a paradox because the income is lowered and the health condition is maybe down and deteriorating, but happiness increases because of the emotional part improves, the view of the world changes, and the older people get smart. That's what I think.
Right, and so, but we can't just be talking about the good stuff, being happy when you get older. So right. we have to kind of tackle the issue that South Korea faces as the population is aging, and what kind of consequences does this situation bring to the society?
Well, most important thing is the economic disadvantages. Older people is becoming poor, and then it's been quite phenomenal, especially in Korea, because most other countries, the poverty issues among the elderly people are similar because they are losing the income resources mostly. But at the same time, most of the OECD member countries, they have a good pension program. So most of the elderly people after retirement ages, and they get the beneficiary of the public pension plan. So that they can be relieved from the absolute poverty level. In the country, Korea's pension program is very discriminating. Those who got the pension as the government workers and the teachers and soldiers, they will get the good pension program. But about 50% of the older elderly people could not get the public pension program. So we have to work on it. The problem is, as elderly people, the size of population becomes larger, the pension fund will be depleted sooner or later. So we can't afford to expand the beneficiary group in any sort of the government policy alternatives. And another thing is health. The Korean healthcare system is number one in the world in any aspect. So people live longer, and then in terms of longevity, Korea will be the oldest country within the 30 years, as the population projection shows. And which is good part, because everybody knows that Korea's medical system is great everybody can get covered, whether you're aged or not. The problem is like the depletion of the pension fund. The financial status in the Korean healthcare system will be in danger. So we have to deal with these things. So therefore, there are issues that people think about the raising retirement ages. Therefore, the beneficiary ages of the pension and other social welfare funding for elder people will be expanded or delayed.
Right, and Professor, well, that really is a concern, how resources and just the finances are being depleted in terms of providing the very much needed healthcare and assistance to this aging population. And well, this is especially a concern for millennials and Gen Zs in Korea as well, because Korea already has a worryingly high level of elderly poverty among OECD countries. And well, in terms of looking at the future, where much of the population will be above a certain age, do you think that means the official age of retirement also needs to be changed?
Well, that could be one of the alternatives. Again, there's no one single answer for this aging society. I can think about three different issues. If we raises the retirement ages sequentially up to 70s over 10 years. So 70 will be the standard retirement age. The first thing is the aging process or the aging society will slow down, just statistically speaking. And second, older people will work longer. And then third thing is the financial soundness of the pension and the government, the pension reservoir becomes healthier. And the issue is that let the older people work longer. Does it help for anyhow? That's negative, because Korea's elderly people, again, was the poorest among the OECD country, but they work harder. About 35% of elder people are still remain in the labor market, which is about 3 times higher than most of the average OECD member countries, which is equivalent to 12% or so. Korea people, elder people work harder, and then they become poorer. And simply raising the retirement age does not really help anyhow, based on this foundational statistic. So we have to find out some other ways to resolve this problem.
I see. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Professor. And this is an issue that will be long debated, but we really appreciate your insights today.
Thanks so much.
And that brings us to the end of our first half of the newscast. We'll be back after the break with more news stories.
We're also going to delve into the quiet quitting trend of workers who no longer want to go the extra mile, but want to go home on time instead.
Wouldn't we all love to do that? Exactly. Well, we've got that coming up for you, so stay tuned to New Day at Arirang.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean New Day. A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now. Maybe this is forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good right now.
Welcome back to New Day at Arirang. Washington says that the upcoming high-level extended deterrence strategy and consultation group talks between the vice defense ministers of South Korea and the U.S. will discuss North Korea's new nuclear law.
The U.S. State Department spokesperson said Wednesday during a briefing that any threat the North poses on the Indo-Pacific would be among items on the agenda at the high-level talks. The meeting is set to take place in Washington, D.C. on Friday. North Korea officially enshrined the right to use preemptive nuclear strikes to protect itself in a new law, according to its state-run media last Friday. Following his visit to Kazakhstan, Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Uzbekistan late Wednesday night, continuing his first overseas trip since the outbreak of COVID-19. The Chinese leader is in the country to take part in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, which brings together 8 member countries across Eurasia. There, he is widely expected to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines. The Kremlin's foreign policy spokesman Yuri Yushakov said that while Putin is set to meet other SCO members during this summit, including the leaders of India, Pakistan and Turkey, his encounter with Xi will be of particular importance. The two leaders are set to discuss the war in Ukraine and a range of regional and international topics. The SCO Summit in Samarkand runs until Friday.
President Volodymyr Zelensky claims his forces have regained about 8,000 square kilometers of territory from Russia. There's a great deal of hope among Ukraine supporters around the world, but others are urging caution, warning the war is far from over. Kim Jung-sil has a full story.
As of now, stabilization measures have been completed in districts with a total area of more than 4,000 square kilometers. Stabilization continues in the liberated territory of approximately the same size.
That adds up to 8,000 square kilometers of territory, which is 2,000 more than what President Zelensky said they'd retaken earlier this week. Ukrainian officials, though, say it's important to make a distinction between taking territory and ensuring it is totally safe. Meanwhile, world leaders are pressuring the Kremlin to end the war. On Tuesday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz spoke on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin, urging him to completely withdraw his troops from Ukraine. According to a German government spokesperson, Chancellor Scholz stressed that any further Russian moves would not go unanswered and would not be recognized under any circumstances. The chancellor urged the Russian president to find a diplomatic solution as soon as possible. U.S. President Joe Biden took a more cautious approach to Ukraine's recent advances. Asked whether Ukraine has reached a turning point in the war, Biden said this.
The question is unanswerable right now. It's hard to tell. It's clear the Ukrainians have made significant progress, but I think it's going to be a long haul.
Meanwhile, the IAEA said Tuesday that all 3 backup power lines to the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia have been restored over the past few days. There's been concern that the southeastern city in Ukraine, occupied by Russian troops since March, could be the scene of a nuclear disaster. As for the Ukrainian economy, there was some positive news Tuesday from the Wall Street Journal, which said that business is picking up again. It said that deliveries by Nova Posta Ukraine's equivalent of FedEx are back to 90% of their pre-war level, and there are more jobs listed on the country's biggest employment website, work.ua. It said Ukraine's recent counterattacks have created enough certainty for economic activity to resume in the parts of Ukraine not occupied by Russia. Kim Jung-sil, Arirang News.
It's time for Global Insight. Going above and beyond your job description has been long considered the default approach to work in the modern economy. But now many workers feel that they don't have to go the extra mile, they just want to go home on time. A recent Gallup survey has shown that there's been a rise of quiet quitters who are not eager to put in extra hours and effort to earn recognition and advance their careers. And this trend seems to go beyond the United States, where the survey was conducted, as keen work as workplace engagement in other parts of the world, including South Korea, continues to slip among young workers, in particular, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. So is this a temporary transition, or is it part of a more permanent change? We discussed this with Jim Harter, Workplace Management and Wellbeing Chief Scientist at Gallup, and Ketek Oh, Director of Wage and Job Innovation Research Center at Korea Labour Institute. A very warm welcome to you both. And well, starting with this survey that's caught a lot of attention around the world, Dr. Harter. Now, there's been a lot of focus on this survey that you conducted regarding quiet quitters. And what is the phenomenon that most workplaces have been experiencing? But was there anything that took you by surprise during your research?
Well, what took me by surprise is how vocal it suddenly became among workers. Good morning, Soo Young. Great to be with you today. The state of mind itself is not new. We've been tracking that at Gallup for a couple of decades. And the state of mind is really about somebody who comes to work and just does the minimum required and not much else. The problem is that that's not good for the employer, because most jobs require people to do more than just basic job requirements. They've got customers that will want random requests. They have colleagues who need things. And it's not good for the employee either, because it affects their well-being. When people resent their workplace, their well-being is generally lower. And so the other surprise, Soo Young, that I thought was kind of interesting is, as you mentioned, it is among younger workers. We're seeing a shift from not just being engaged or not engaged at work, but actually being actively disengaged. That's gone up significantly. So they're almost like they're loud quitters.
Right, and well, Dr. Harter, well, traditionally, career-minded employees, they chose to and were rather expected to go above and beyond. And well, this was very much the approach they had to work. And as a result, they often worked more than the assumed 40-hour work week in a competitive employee marketplace. So what really happened with these quiet quitters? What has driven this demotivation among American workers?
There's been a big drop in people feeling their employer cares about their well-being. There have been some increases in burnout as a result of that. And what that tells me is that employees and employers are becoming more distant, and employers are less in touch with their employees and what's going on in their lives. And that's a big problem. It can be fixed. It can definitely be improved on and fixed. But right now, due to all the things that have happened in the last few years, there's more of a separation between employee and employer. And that's a problem. People feel less connected to the mission of their company, and they feel less clear even about what's expected of them at work. Among young, remote working employees, remote and hybrid working employees, only 4 in 10 clearly know what's expected of them at work. That's a problem. That probably means they're doing less than the minimum required.
I see. And Dr. Oh, well, this research from Gallup showed that more than half of American workers engage in quiet quitting, doing the bare minimum rather than going above and beyond, of course. But are we seeing this trend as well of quiet quitting in South Korea as well?
I think the Korean labor market...
Sorry, that's to you,
that's
Dr.
my
Oh.
question. I think the Korean labor market also experience more and more of this science quitting syndrome in the near future. Since Korean labor market is less flexible than U.S. labor market so far, Korean labor market would experience less science quitting syndrome until now. Traditionally, Korean labor market has a lifetime employment system, like a Japanese system in the past, in which workers spend all lifetime in the same company if they choose their first company. However, labor market mobility is increasing in Korea too. Workers in small and medium-sized companies are already quite mobile, and nowadays white-collar and professional workers in large companies started to move around the company, looking for better working conditions and better job with their fit, with their preferences. If they have alternative employment chances in other company, then they would choose to move to other company. However, even though they have some complaints in the current company, they would choose to stay in the current company and do not work hard if they do not have a good enough alternative employment chances in other companies. Therefore, I think Korean labor market has a high chance of experiencing science quitting syndrome sooner or later.
And Dr. Rowe, well, what kinds of employment conditions are young South Koreans seeking then, particularly the Gen Z generation?
I think Generation Zs have a unique value and culture. They emphasize fairness especially. They tend to compare their job to other jobs with similar job content and then job performance. If they fear some unfairness in the process, they strongly argue to restore this unfairness. They also have a big preference for better working conditions, including a relatively high salary level. However, they also prefer to better work and life balance too. If they have to choose between relatively high salary level and better work and life balance, I think they would choose better work-life balance, unlike older Korean workers who would choose the relatively high salary level. The Generation Zs also have a high preference for their job and career development. Traditionally, Korean workers have a strong identity with their company rather than their job. However, Generation Zs would prefer more to their job rather than current company. Therefore, they have a more interest in career development. Even though they do not have a further employment chance in the current company, they wanted to have some alternative employment chances in other companies. To increase these alternative employment chances, they wanted their current company to invest more for their competence development.
I see. And Dr. Harter, well, do you think quiet quitting is a temporary phenomenon, or do you think it signifies more fundamental changes?
Well, it has existed for decades. It's being more vocalized right now, and the deterioration of engagement does mean that it's getting worse, and it could get even worse over time if employees and employers aren't better connected. And I think there are solutions to that related to what managers can do and how they can be upskilled.
I see. And Dr. Rowe, well, what's your opinion on this with this sort of generational shift that we're seeing? Are we just simply seeing a generational change, or the nature of work changing, or do you think it's both?
I think it will be experience both of them. The new generation is a generation of more tough labor market. Even though they have a higher level of education compared to their parents' counterparts, they would have less employment chance. And then even though they find some employment chances, their working conditions and employment status is less stable. Therefore, they tend to feel more stress in the working life and more chance to be exhausted. I think the new generation could not be fully free from these structural limitations. However, they would try to find a way to decrease the negative effects of this phenomenon. One of the responses of new generation would be the nature of work changing. To say they are less likely to be involved with their working life, have less identity with their company, and more likely to be emphasize their personal life. Therefore, companies which have to manage this new generation have to understand the changes of work nature of this generation and better to create a new management style to cope with these big changes.
So, Dr. Harter, well, your research has shown that employee engagement has been going down, particularly since the second half of last year, and you presented some solutions to quiet quitting as well. So what would some of those solutions be?
I'd say the first thing is to address manager engagement. Only about a third of managers are engaged in their work. And if managers aren't engaged and they feel more burnout, you're probably not going to solve the issue of the quiet quitters or people being disengaged at work. Second, managers need to learn how to have the conversations to help employees reduce disengagement and burnout. Only managers are in position to know the situation each employee is going through and what's going on in their lives. And so they have to be upskilled so they can have those conversations. Gallup has found that the best requirement for for them to develop is to develop a habit of having at least one meaningful conversation every week, 15 to 30 minutes with each employee, so they know what's going on in their life. They know they can rehash their priorities. They can recognize them for the good work that they've done. And they can have conversations about how they and their colleagues can collaborate effectively together and set priorities. So I think one meaningful conversation a week is a really good goal. And I think managers can be upskilled to do those kinds of things. And they need to build in accountability so that individuals know how they're doing in terms of their performance, that they know how well they're collaborating with the people around them, and really, really importantly, that they know what value they're bringing to their customers. We've seen some deterioration in our data in how employees feel about how customers are being served. And there's national data that shows that customers feel the same way. So that's a big risk, but it can be solved with good management.
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of addressing the sort of work-life balance that the younger generations want, Dr. Oh, it seems that some countries are turning to flexible working and employment conditions, such as a 4-day work week. But in South Korea, though, only really white-collar conglomerate workers can actually take advantage of such systems. So what do you think could be done to ensure that all workers can really enjoy a better work-life balance?
I think dual labor market problems are prominent in Korean labor market. The difference wage level between large company and then small and medium-sized company is relatively larger compared to Western advanced countries and Japan. Other differences in working condition, like company welfare and then working arrangements, are also relatively big. Now, the gap between these two groups is too big to be ignored in the Korean labor market and in the Korean society. Therefore, it is time to think of how to decrease this gap in the Korean labor market. I think it is not an easy job because this gap consists of many, many years of experiences and practices in the Korean labor market. But I think Korean labor market has to move towards to direction of decreasing this gap rather than increasing this gap. One of the ways to decrease this gap is to assign responsibility of carrying their supply chains to large companies. Since these large companies have a deep influence in their supply chain, they can exercise some influence on working condition and work arrangement of their supply chains. Therefore, Korean society can impose some obligation on these large companies to synchronize their working conditions and work arrangement with their supply chains in some extent. In the process of trying this effort, I think we can decrease this gap even though we cannot fully eliminate it.
Mm. And well, lastly, Dr. Harter, well, this whole quiet quitting phenomenon seems a little ironic, really, because before the pandemic, there were concerns about workers being replaced by artificial intelligence. But now it seems that we're rather taking ourselves out of the game even before automation makes us obsolete. So what are ways to promote productivity instead, perhaps using tech?
Well, I think organizations need to really focus in on the fundamentals of building a workplace culture that transcend time and geography, and even across different economic times. And the fundamentals of management come down to some basics that often get ignored, unfortunately. One is working with employees to set priorities and goals and involve them in setting those priorities and goals so they feel some ownership for it. Second is to be in touch with them through the ongoing conversations that they have on a regular basis so that they know what's going on in their lives and they can help them feel a part of the mission or purpose of their organization. Too many people now don't, and that's a problem. And finally, managers need to build in some accountability so that people know how well they're doing and know how well they're progressing. Too often, these kinds of things are ignored. And so I agree the labor market is a big factor. I agree technology can potentially be a big factor into the future. Even immigration can be a big factor. But outside of all that, fundamentally, if organizations want to build a reliable culture that is resilient in tough times and thriving in good times, they need to keep focusing on those fundamentals of management. And we've seen organizations move from well below 30% of engaged employees all the way up to 70% by working on those kinds of fundamentals. And that's why I feel very confident it can be done and is very solvable.
Well, that was Jim Harter, Workplace Management and Wellbeing Chief Scientist at Gallup, and Ketego, Director of Wage and Job Innovation Research Centre at Korea Labour Institute. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Soo-young.
For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley standing by at the Arirang newsroom. Good morning.
Good morning to you as well.
Hi, Matt. Let's start in Sweden, as the sitting Prime Minister has conceded election defeat.
Well, that's right. So Sweden's incumbent PM Magdalena Andersson admitted election defeat to the right-wing opposition bloc on Wednesday local time. Now, the election was held Sunday and saw razor-thin margins between the left and right coalitions. The announcement now comes as early votes and those cast from abroad have also been counted, handing the opposition coalition a 3-seat majority in parliament. Now, while some votes still need to be counted, the remaining ballots are unlikely to change the results. Sweden's next prime minister is likely to be Ulf Kristersson, the head of the moderate party. The right-wing bloc consists of 4 parties, including the far-right Sweden Democrats. Voter issues in this election were related to Europe's energy crisis, inflation, crime and immigration. Now, millions of residents along the coast of China are preparing themselves for heavy rains, gale-force winds and floods. This comes as Typhoon Muifa made landfall in the eastern Chinese port city of Zhoushan on Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. local time. Now, in preparation for the typhoon, Zhejiang province closed schools, evacuated tourists from local islands and called all nearby ships into port. Muifa is this season's 12th typhoon and is now bound for Shanghai. Now, at the time of its arrival, Chinese authorities classified it as a strong typhoon, the second highest in the country's tropical cyclone classification system. It is also the most powerful tropical cyclone to impact the Yangtze River Delta in over 10 years. Now, Argentina's monthly inflation rate in August has surged past 7%. The higher than anticipated figure means that Argentina's inflation over the last 12 months has reached 78.5%, one of the world's highest levels. The data released on Wednesday showed August's inflation rate was down slightly from July, but was still 0.4% higher than originally expected. A poll by Argentina's central bank saw local economists estimate that the country could see annual inflation climb to 95% by the end of the year. It comes as the nation grapples with skyrocketing consumer prices amid a debt and currency crisis. And finally, Dutch students from Eindhoven University of Technology have created what could be the world's most sustainable all-electric car. Called ZEM, or Zero Emission Mobility, the sporty 2-seater is able to capture more carbon than it emits. Now, it does this by using 2 filters capable of taking in 2 kilograms of CO2 over 32,000 kilometers of driving. Now, the car was designed to minimize carbon dioxide emissions throughout its lifespan. Most parts of the car are made using recycled plastics that have been 3D printed. The vehicle was also designed to be easily separated and recycled at the end of its use.
Good morning. It will feel warmer than yesterday across Korea, and much of western parts of the country will notice highs that are above 30 degrees Celsius this afternoon, leading to wide gaps in ratings between the lows and highs. It's a breezy start to the day, except on Jeju with rain along with strong winds. Jeju and the south coast is still feeling the indirect effect of Typhoon Muifa, but it's a brighter start in the capital region. Then highs in Seoul and Daejeon will go up to 30 degrees, Daegu topping out at 27 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Now, tropical storm Nammador is gaining strength as it develops, and right now it's moving from waters east-southeast of Okinawa and forecast to reach Japan's Kagoshima prefecture early next week. So eastern parts of Korea are forecast to be indirectly affected by the typhoon with heavy rain and strong gusts as early as this Sunday. So let's keep monitoring the situation. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
That wraps up our newscast for this hour. We'll be back tomorrow, though, for our Friday's edition of New Day at Arirang.
Thanks for joining us this morning, and do tune in to Arirang News for updates throughout the day. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.